This is part 2 of the exchange rates video series. In this video we'll be looking at the effects of changes in the exchange rate on consumers and producers. So exchange rates can change in one of two ways. So currencies can appreciate, in other words, these currencies can increase in price or value in terms of other currencies, or currencies can depreciate, in other words, decrease in price or value in terms of other currencies. We're now going to look at the effects of currencies appreciating and depreciating here. Firstly, currency appreciation. Let's compare the pound to the dollar, and we'll be using this example throughout. So let's say that the exchange rate between the pound and the dollar starts off at £1 to $1.30. If the pound appreciates, this means that you can now buy more dollars with each pound. So one example of the pound appreciating could be when the exchange rate goes from £1 to $1.30 to £1 to $1.50. In this case, the pound buys more dollars, and so the pound is appreciated compared to the dollar. As explained in the previous video, an appreciation of the pound in this case will lead to a depreciation of the US dollar. This means that for American consumers, British exports are more expensive. This is because for every pound that the exported goods are worth, American consumers will have to exchange more dollars in order to purchase that good or service. Having to spend more and exchange more in order to acquire those British exports means that obviously those exports become more expensive. And this is the case for any country whose currency has depreciated compared to the pound. From the law of demand, we know that if the price of a good or service increases, then quantity demanded for that good or service decreases, and therefore the appreciation of the pound and consequently the depreciation of these foreign currencies means that quantity demanded for British exports decreases, and this is bad for exporting firms. Now let's look at imports. The appreciation of the pound means that British consumers can acquire more foreign currency for each pound they exchange. This means that if the price of foreign imports stays the same, so we're assuming ceteris paribus here, then imports for British consumers become cheaper. This applies to both British firms and British consumers. The distinction between domestic firms and domestic consumers in this case is very important. Firstly, if we look at consumers, obviously imports becoming cheaper for consumers is a good thing, because this means that with the limited budgets, limited disposable income consumers have a higher purchasing power, and so they can buy more goods and services, increasing their living standards. So currency appreciation is a good thing for domestic consumers. With domestic firms, however, it's a slightly more complicated issue. For domestic firms who are always going to import their raw materials, possibly because those materials aren't available in their country, then currency appreciation is a very good thing, because like with domestic consumers, whatever these firms import becomes cheaper. Therefore, costs of production go down, allowing them to increase profit levels, which can then be used in many ways. For example, in increased investment in research and development, etc. This will also likely make these firms more internationally competitive, as they can also pass these cost benefits down to consumers in the form of reduced prices. However, the issue arises when these raw materials are available in the country. Currency appreciation, as we know, makes imports cheaper, and therefore currency appreciation may encourage domestic businesses to import their raw materials instead of sourcing them from within their country. This is obviously bad for those domestic businesses who could have supplied those raw materials. You can say that currency appreciation makes some firms better off and makes them more internationally competitive, but makes other firms worse off, making them less internationally competitive. The opposite is true with currency depreciation. As you can see with the example, before £1 would have got you $1.50, and now £1 only gets you $1.30, denoting a depreciation of the pound with respect to the dollar. Again, let's look at the impact of this depreciation on exports and imports. We know that if one currency depreciates with respect to another, then that other currency appreciates with respect to the first currency. Therefore, a depreciation in the pound means that the dollar, which we're comparing the pound to, has appreciated, meaning that for each dollar you can now buy more pounds. This means that British exports become cheaper for foreign consumers. So in this case, British exports become cheaper for American consumers, because they have to exchange less dollars in order to buy those goods and services from the UK. Therefore, the price of exports from the UK decreases, increasing the quantity demanded of exports through the law of demand. Therefore, currency depreciation is good for exporting firms because it means that there's increased demand for exports, meaning they sell more, make more revenue. Therefore, currency depreciation is good for exporting firms. However, a depreciation of the pound makes imports more expensive for domestic firms and consumers. If there are some raw materials for firms or some goods and services for consumers which simply cannot be sourced from within the country, then currency depreciation is going to be bad because it will increase the price of imports, which they cannot avoid, increasing costs of production for firms, and reducing the quantity of goods and services consumers can import, given the fact that consumers have scarce disposable income to spend on goods and services. However, by making it more expensive to import goods and services, currency depreciation is also really good for businesses within a country who can supply alternatives to these imports. Imports being more expensive means that domestic firms and consumers will increasingly turn to these domestic alternatives, meaning demand for these domestic alternatives increases, which is obviously good for these domestic firms producing these alternatives. This will lead to increased domestic production, especially for those companies I was talking about, allowing them to make more revenue and more profit. Here are two acronyms you can use to help make explaining the effects of changes in exchange rates easier. Firstly, SPICED. This stands for strengthening pound, so an appreciating pound leads to cheaper imports and dearer, more expensive exports. And conversely, we have WPIDEC. So a weakening pound, a depreciating pound will lead to dearer imports and cheaper exports. From these two acronyms, you'll be able to explain everything that we went through in the previous slide. However, there are two main caveats to the explanations I gave earlier, and you can use these as evaluative points in exam essays. Firstly, price isn't the only factor determining demand for imports of goods and services. I talked about how, through the law of demand, if imports are more expensive, then quantity demanded of those imports will fall. However, it's more complex than that, because there may be other factors that affect demand for imports. For example, quality. If the price of imports goes up, but the quality of the goods and services that you import is higher than what you may receive if you bought domestically, you may decide to simply bear the brunt of the increased costs of these imports, chiefly because the quality is so high. And so there are other factors that come into play apart from price when we look at demand for imports of goods and services. And this links very closely with price elasticity of demand, because changes in price lead to different scales, different levels of changes in quantity demanded, depending on the price elasticity of demand value. And that PED value is affected by some of those other factors, apart from price, that affect demand for imports of goods and services. Here are some summary questions you can try to test your knowledge of the material covered in this video. Thank you very much for listening.